You clicked on a thumbnail showing a copper wire wrapped around a plant. And if you have spent any real time growing your own food, something about that image hit differently than the usual gardening content. Somewhere in your gut, you already suspect that what you have been told about how plants grow is only part of the story. What you are about to learn did not come from a university lab last year. It came from the fields, specifically from Amish farms in Lancaster County, Pennsylvania, and Holmes County, Ohio. These are communities that have been quietly doing something with copper wire and the Earth's own energy, something that the rest of American agriculture abandoned nearly 100 years ago. It was documented, buried, and then confirmed again at a scale of over 6,000 football fields halfway across the world. And at the very end of this video, I'm going to show you one specific variation of this method that I have never seen mentioned in any gardening guide, any homesteading forum, or any video on this platform. A technique that combines two simple pieces of copper wire in a configuration that changes everything about how the root zone holds electrical charge. It is the detail that separates the people who get dramatic results from the people who try this once and give up. Stay with me until the end. You will understand why it matters. Most people who have heard of electroculture wave it off as pseudoscience, and I get it. I was exactly that person for years. I grew up doing things the conventional way. I bought the fertilizer. I followed the extension service recommendations. And I consistently got the same mediocre results that told me I was missing something but never quite told me what. What changed everything for me was not a book. It was time spent with Amish families who were feeding themselves and their neighbors without a single bag of synthetic input and producing harvests that should not have been possible given the inputs involved. Here is what I eventually dug up in the historical record that made me realize this was not folk wisdom, it was suppressed science. In 1918, the British government established the Electroculture Committee under the Ministry of Agriculture. This was not a fringe group. It was a government-funded scientific body with a specific mandate to determine whether electrical stimulation of plants was real enough to matter at a national scale. They collected field photographs, they reviewed yield records, they sent observers to experimental plots across Europe, they reviewed the work of inventors, including a French farmer, inventor named Justin Christoflo, who on October 26, 1925 filed a patent in Switzerland, document number CH118648A, for what he called an electromagnetic apparatus designed to capture atmospheric electricity and channel it directly into the root zone. The British Electroculture Committee ran for nearly 2 decades, right up until 1936. Their files were stamped not for publication, not disproved, not refuted, not replaced by better science. This is where the Amish story comes in, because what happened next in mainstream agriculture is the reason these communities became the last living repository of this knowledge. When the Haber-Bosch process began flooding the market with synthetic ammonia in the late 1930s and through the 1940s, farmers across America made the switch. It was cheaper. It was measurable. You poured it on and you got a result. Fertilizer costs dropped from over $100 per ton to under $30 per ton by the mid-20th century. Production rose from just over 1 million tons per year to nearly 20 million tons per year by 1960. The economics were hard to argue with in the short term. The Amish did not make that switch, not because they were behind the times, because they were paying attention to something that a fertilizer invoice could not teach you. Lancaster County and Holmes County farmers had 40 and 50 years of observation to draw on, and what they had observed was that certain fields consistently outperformed others regardless of soil amendment. Fields where copper trellising had been in place for decades. fields where the wire had never been pulled, fields where planting rows ran in a specific direction that nobody had written a rule about, but that experienced farmers did instinctively. They did not call it electroculture. They did not need to. It was just the way you farmed if you wanted your crops to come in the way they were supposed to. But I need to stop here for a moment, because the reason this whole thing gets dismissed has less to do with whether it works and more to do with people not understanding the physics underneath it. So let me walk you through that, because once it clicks, everything else makes sense on a level that no one can argue with. Right now, above every inch of your garden, there is an invisible electrical gradient running continuously from the sky down to the earth. Physicists call it the atmospheric potential gradient. On a clear day, the voltage difference between the ground and the air just 1 meter above it is approximately 100 volts. That gradient never shuts off. It does not take a day off in the winter. It does not stop when you are not watching. It is as constant and as measurable as gravity, and the overwhelming majority of gardeners have never once been told it exists. I certainly was not in 40 years of conventional growing. Here is the part that genuinely floored me when I first understood it. Your plants already know about it. Every stem, every leaf, every root hair is already sitting inside that electrical field. The waxy coating on leaves, the fine hairs on stems, and the root tips branching through the soil all conduct electrical charge from the positive air down into the negative earth. The plant is a living antenna. It bridges the gap between sky and ground, whether you do anything to help it or not. And inside plant tissue, tiny electrical signals called action potentials move between cells at measurable speeds. These are the same class of signal that runs through your nervous system, and plants use them to communicate. When a leaf is damaged, an electrical pulse travels down the stem, alerting the root system to shift resources. When photosynthesis increases, internal electrical gradients shift in response. When a plant is under stress from heat or drought, the whole internal electrical network responds. University researchers using fine electrodes have mapped these signals in detail. What they found is that an external electrical gradient, even a very faint one, triggers measurable downstream effects. Antioxidant production increases. Genes tied to growth and resilience activate. Photosynthetic efficiency improves. The plant is not just passively sitting in electricity. It is responding to it the way a muscle responds to the right training stimulus, and it ramps up when the signal is right. Now here is the question that kept me up the night I first put this together. If every plant is already drawing on this field naturally, and if a copper wire conducts electricity hundreds of times more efficiently than a plant stem, what happens when you give your plants a better antenna? The Amish had already answered that question over decades of observation, but the rest of the world needed the science to catch up, and it eventually did, in a place and at a scale that made the results impossible to dismiss. The most compelling modern evidence for electroculture at a practical farming scale did not come from a backyard experiment. It did not come from a hobby plot or a YouTube video. It came from the Chinese Academy of Agricultural Sciences. Their experiment covered 3,600 hectares of working farmland, an area larger than 6,000 football fields, using high-voltage wires suspended above the crops to harness and amplify the same atmospheric gradient that copper spirals tap passively. No synthetic fertilizers, no added pesticides, just atmospheric electricity directed into the root zone. The yield increase across the trial fields came in at nearly 30%, 30% more wheat, 30% more rice, 30% more vegetables without a single additional bag of synthetic input. But the yield number was not even the result that stopped me cold when I read the study. Pesticide use dropped by 70 to 100%. In some regions where insect pressure had been unmanageable for years, it essentially vanished. The mechanism, as the researchers identified it, is that electrically stimulated plants produce significantly higher levels of their own natural defense compounds. The volatile oils and antioxidant chemicals that make certain plants naturally pest-resistant. The plants did not need the pesticide because they were strong enough to handle the pressure themselves. That is not a chemical intervention. That is the plant's own biology activated at a higher level by the electrical environment it was growing in. This study was not published in a fringe newsletter. It came out of an institutional research body in a country that feeds 1.4 billion people. They ran this test because the math on chemical inputs had stopped working and they needed an alternative that scaled. They found it in the same atmospheric gradient that Justin Christoflo described in a Swiss patent in 1925, and that the British Electroculture Committee was documenting in the same decade. Which brings me back to the question I raised at the beginning. Why did virtually everyone walk away from this research at exactly the moment that synthetic fertilizers became commercially dominant? Here is the economics of it. A copper spiral planted in the soil works for years. You buy it once. You plant it once. The energy it harvests is free, already in the air above your head, already flowing through your ground. You cannot build a recurring revenue model around free atmospheric electricity. You cannot send a farmer an invoice for the Earth's electric field. The fertilizer model, by contrast, was perfectly engineered for profit. You bought it every spring. It did not build lasting soil structure. It delivered a seasonal result, and then it was gone. The next season, same purchase, same invoice, same dependency. By 1960, that dependency was built into the infrastructure of American agriculture. Editors who had covered Christoflo's work with genuine curiosity in the 1920s began describing it with words like miracle claims and eccentric methods. Agricultural journals quietly stopped accepting manuscripts on the subject. University researchers dependent on industry funding avoided studies that might produce inconvenient results. The British Electroculture Committee's files, 2 full decades of documented evidence, went into a drawer marked not for publication and stayed there. Today, global fertilizer use tops 185 million tons a year. The soil health on conventional farmland is declining measurably across most of the developed world. The costs keep rising, and the Amish are still farming the way they always have, quietly producing harvests that make their neighbors' chemical-fed fields look tired by comparison. Let me show you exactly how to build the passive copper spiral that comes out of this tradition. Start with 14-gauge bare copper wire. Not coated, not insulated, bare copper, so the wire is in direct contact with both the air and the soil. Wrap it into a loose spiral around a wooden dowel that is 12 to 16 millimeters wide. Use the dowel as a form to keep the coil even. Your finished spiral should have a diameter between 5 and 20 centimeters with at least 3 turns, spaced so that air and light reach through the gaps. Do not pack it tight. Drive the dowel into the soil so the base of the spiral sits 10 to 15 centimeters below the surface. The top of the spiral should sit just above the soil line, reaching up into the air column. Here's the step that almost every tutorial gets wrong or skips entirely. The tip of the spiral must face magnetic north. Use a compass. This is not optional and it is not decorative. The Earth's telluric currents, the natural electrical currents that flow through the soil itself, run along a roughly north-south axis. A spiral oriented to work with that flow pulls in more charge than one that fights it. An Amish farmer in Lancaster County explained it to me as simply as you could put it. You would not plant a weather vane sideways. Same idea. Position the spiral 10 to 20 centimeters from the base of your plant. Tomatoes, beans, squash, and leafy greens all respond well. One Amish family I spent time with in Lancaster County used a spiral at the base of every other row in their kitchen garden and rotated the placement each season to prevent copper from concentrating in any one spot. A sensible precaution since copper is both a beneficial plant micronutrient and, in high accumulation, a mild soil inhibitor. A grower in Ohio I connected with through the homesteading community tracked his results carefully over one full growing season, using a single copper spiral per row of lettuce. Same soil, same water, same seed source as the previous year. He measured plant height every 2 weeks, tracked pest activity, and weighed the final harvest. The yield came in 40% higher than the previous season. Aphid pressure dropped within the first month. No powdery mildew by harvest. He spent less than the price of a cup of coffee on the wire. Now, I want to pay off the promise I made at the beginning. The technique I have never seen written down anywhere outside of conversations with old-timers in Holmes County, Ohio, when you are working with depleted ground, land that a chemical farm left behind, soil that has lost its biological activity and its structure. The vertical spiral alone may not be enough. The atmospheric charge it captures tends to dissipate quickly through soil that has poor conductivity and low organic matter. The charge passes through and keeps going rather than staying in the root zone where you need it. What the older Amish farmers used in this situation, and what I have only ever seen described as a practical farming technique, never in a gardening book or academic paper, is a horizontal ground wire buried at root depth, running east to west, perpendicular to the north-south orientation of the vertical spiral. You bury it 15 to 20 centimeters below the surface before planting, 2 to 3 weeks ahead of your seeds going in. Bare copper wire, horizontal, running straight across the bed. What this creates is a two-component system. The vertical spiral acts as an antenna, reaching up into the atmospheric gradient, and the horizontal wire acts as a ground plane at root level. Together, they form a closed electrical circuit that holds the atmospheric charge in the root zone rather than letting it drain through the soil and dissipate. The roots sit inside a maintained electrical field rather than a passing one. Anyone who has studied radio engineering will recognize this immediately. It is a monopole antenna over a ground plane, one of the most efficient antenna configurations ever developed. The same geometric principle is used in broadcast towers and communication arrays across the world. Whoever first applied this design to soil understood exactly what they were doing, even if they described it in the language of farming rather than the language of physics. The Holmes County farmer who taught me this said his grandfather did it on every plot he ever worked. going back to a time before anyone in his community had a name for it. He described it as giving the roots something to hold on to. In physics terms, what he described is a maintained resonant field at root depth. In farming terms, it is the difference between soil that is alive to the electrical environment around it and soil that is just sitting there waiting for the next bag of fertilizer to arrive. He has not purchased synthetic fertilizer in 31 years, not once, and he has not had a crop failure on the plots where he uses this system. That is not a miracle. That is physics working the way physics works when you stop fighting the field that nature already built and start working with it. What you just learned today is not new. It is recovered, and there is a difference that matters. New knowledge asks you to trust something unproven. Recovered knowledge asks you to look at what was quietly removed from the conversation, filed under not for publication, buried under a mountain of fertilizer marketing, and ask yourself who benefited from keeping you from knowing it. If you are the kind of person who believes that the most important agricultural knowledge was not invented in a chemical plant, that it is in the soil, in the history, in the hands of communities that never stopped practicing it, then you already know where this leads next. Tell me in the comments, have you tried any form of passive electroculture on your own property? Even something as simple as leaving copper in the ground long term, because what I keep hearing from people who experiment with this is that the results always come with the same reaction. Why did nobody ever tell me this before? Subscribe, because the next thing we are uncovering in this series goes even deeper into what traditional farming communities preserved that modern agriculture discarded. And what is coming next makes the copper wire look like the obvious part.